African Americans dominate the prison system. We are the majority of the prison population. We also are the majority of individuals, as you know, and somebody referenced Richard Rothstein's book, how redlining and mortgage loans and the GI Bill disenfranchised blacks and left blacks in a certain part of town, as well as housing covenants, which wasn't mentioned today. But housing covenants were white landlords who were predominantly landowners said that, we ain't letting no Negroes live here, which is why in every single city in the United States, except for a chosen few, you see predominantly black people in a specific area of town, and that's typically the poor part of town. Again, I'm preaching to the choir, so I don't have to give a whole bunch of references. You can look this stuff up on your own. But as I'm preaching to the choir, understand that this is the social economic circumstance in 2019. So we took the civil rights movement from 1968, fast forward 60, 70 years, we're still in the same condition. We're still talking about disparity for black people. And we also have the nerve to say, guess what, there's a whole new group of people who need rights. And we ain't fixed the right for the other people. And then got even more nerve to tell black people that they need to join the struggles of other people and help them out. And then we want to talk about intersectionality. Malcolm X said it best. If blacks cannot be seen as valuable among themselves, how can they integrate with the other people? So we first have to get over our disparities, reach an equality level, and then we can start talking about reconciliation on a racial level in between the two. But until then, we still have other fights to fight. Meanwhile, we want to move on and talk about the cost of living that blacks have to live. Because when we talk about the cost of living, we're typically talking about how much does the cost of living in New York. Has anybody ever lived in New York? It's expensive. I never lived in New York, but I give tours at the Malcolm X Center, and people from New York say this stuff is cheap when we think this is expensive. People from California come to the Malcolm X Memorial Foundation, and they tell me how expensive it is. Now, I've driven to California, it's very expensive. But the cost of living I'm talking about is not financial all the time. We pay a cultural cost, a great cultural cost. The cost of living among blacks. There's higher prices in the stores. This is something that Malcolm X had much reference. Now, if you don't believe me, go to Baker's on 132nd and West Center Road. Then drive across town and go to Baker's on 30th and Weber. And look at the price of macaroni and cheese, and you will be astonished at how they can get away with charging 55 cents more at 30th Street than they can on 120th and West Center Road. It doesn't make sense to me. You don't believe me? Call your insurance company and tell them you moved into North Omaha. You will quickly call back and say, change that address. Because your insurance is going to skyrocket in that area versus when you're out on 132nd and West Center Road. That's the cost of living that the predominant culture, mainly blacks in North Omaha, have to deal with. The cost of helping other movements. In the state of New York decided to pass legislation that said LGBT individuals are considered minority, which we all cheer as a human rights win. But what this has actually done is allowed white gay men to outdo black people for minority contracts in the state of New York. Black people are losing the so-called privilege of minority contracts to white gay men. In 2019, that's the reality. So, in the LGBT movement itself, blacks have been disenfranchised in the LGBT movement. Though we're talking about this movement being about all humans, it was so bad that the Human Rights Campaign actually decided to add 2 colors to the rainbow-colored flag, which was a black and brown, to say we're going to include the blacks because they feel disenfranchised. So, even if a black person decides, you know what, I'm non-binary, I just want to be a human being, they still have to fight to be a part of that movement alone. Let's talk about keeping up the dominant culture. African American people spend a lot more money on perms, relaxers, haircuts, so they don't offend people when they walk into the job site with an afro, locks, or dreads. That's an expense that most of us would assume doesn't matter until a person wants to move up socially. especially coming from an African-American background. Let's talk about the cost of sending your child as an African-American into a school system that has been failing them for generations. These children don't qualify for Ivy League scholarships. They end up taking, if they get one, a local scholarship funded by some funder who said, I have pity on those people. Those students write a sad story about how they grew up disenfranchised, and they get a 4-year scholarship to a college that they're unprepared to attend. Because the education system passed them through, thanks to our previous president, George Bush, who said no child should be left behind even if you can't read. And so you have to create supplemental programs, which we see at UNO down the street, like TRIO, TLC, that coddle these students to try to bring them up to speed because they're not prepared for the workload of college-level education. This is the truth about Omaha, Nebraska, where you live. I'm not talking about some pie-in-the-sky place or theory I heard from some PhD. This is stuff that's happening right here. But we all want to see the human family do well. And America is a shining example of how we can all get along, but yet still we see disparity. That's the cost of living of being black. So what do? We have to bring balance to this conversation. I'm here to speak my piece and my truth from the African American experience. I can only speak from the African American experience. I'm referencing some other things, but that's all a part of my experience. So, if we want to be the best country we can be, we have to make sure that the most oppressed group of people in this country are able to rise and be seen as equal among the masses, among the dominant culture that has permeated throughout this country. So what we need to do is, number one, start sharing our cultural rules. There are cultural rules that middle class, upper class, and general white society lives by, such as sending your children to Boy Scouts. Black children don't go to Boy Scouts. So where do they learn their discipline? Where do they learn how to tie a knot? Where do they learn how to achieve merit and get a badge for it? They don't, so they start gangs. They create their own version of Boy Scouts. And they do things like spray paint buildings, get into fights, rob something, steal something, challenge themselves to gain the courage, and then get married by being called an OG because they did a prison sentence. That's the rites of passage for little African American boys. African American girls, a little bit different because Omaha, Nebraska, and other states seem to think that they can just keep throwing money at African American girls and build facilities and start girl empowerment programs and completely ignore the boys except for creating one center on the north side. We want to look at we want to just step out and do a topographical, sociological study of Omaha, Nebraska. You will see how it systematically disenfranchises a specific cultural group of people and keeps us in a specific place. I don't like it. That's why I do what I do. I avoided becoming a statistic. I hit the streets. I did things I wasn't supposed to do. I got arrested. I got gun charges. I escaped those things, luckily, by the grace. And since I did, I owe it to the higher power to make sure that I do the work. We need to do homework of the heart. That's the next step. Too many people want to throw money at projects and programs that sound good. They don't do the research. They don't go visit the program. You don't go see what they're actually doing or who they're serving. You take the word of a piece of paper that somebody eloquently typed up because they have a degree in doing so. And then they send it across your desk and they tell you you should fund this. But I work with the Malcolm X Memorial Foundation. We built a community garden out of 60,000 pounds of concrete. People hand-moved that concrete after beating it with sledgehammers because they were passionate about building a community garden and being part of something epic and historic. We never wrote a grant for it. We never wrote it on paper. We took pictures, we put it on social media and said, this is what we've done, everybody look at it, and that was it. Got a few likes and people moved on. No funders, no individuals came by and said, that's great work, Leo, we want to keep that going. It wasn't until we had to actually sit down with someone and explain to them the process where they said, you know what, I really want to support that. And we got a little bit of funding. But when we talk about reparations and support, you have to now start doing homework of the heart, because the old way don't work. That's how we ended up where we are today. Doing it the old way, administrative, office style. Get up out of bed, put on some tennis shoes, go to the program that you say you want to support and see if they're for real. Because I know too many people who do real work who don't know how to write up a proposal. What they do know how to do is the work that they do. And if you had them do something else, they would no longer be effective. This is why you need to let them do what they do. You've all worked a 9-to-5 job somewhere, and you know what it's like when you're the best employee and somebody worse than you gets a promotion over you. And you're like, how did that happen? Because you were good at your position, and the job understood that if they moved you from that position, it would be worse on them because you're too good at what you do. He starts like, no. No, but seriously. We need to reform education, not in the way that we have traditionally done so. We don't need to go out and change the voting process and all these things. We need to start acknowledging the fact that people have different skills, different talents, and know different things. And when we see that talent, we see that skill, do our best to place a person in that position. I was lucky enough to have some teachers that encouraged me in the skill set that I had. One of those even being Jane Erdenberger, sitting in the room right now, who was one of my first social studies teachers. Mr. Schultz. Another social studies teacher. And most importantly, what I want to wrap up by saying is we need to gauge our work by the results that are being done. We can no longer gauge it by the drop in statistics. If you don't feel in the environment that things have truly changed, then they have not. Because let the Omaha Police Department tell it, gun violence is down. Been down for a few years. Well, let me give you a news break. Gun violence is down nationally, and that has very little to do with the efforts of Omaha 360. It has more to do with changing times. The fact that individuals don't want to commit crimes where everybody can pull out a cell phone camera on them. The fact that if they're going to commit crime, a lot of it's happening individually because gangs are breaking apart. They don't exist like they used to. Robberies are harder to commit. There's too much tracking. So statistically, crime is going down, and that's a national thing. But who wants to talk about the suicides that are going up? Nobody. Who wants to talk about the mental illness that's running rampant? Only a few. We're hinting to it with the opioid crisis. That means people are medicating themselves. Instead of doing harm to others, they're just doing harm to themselves, and that's just as epidemic as anything else. So I will leave you with these last little words. I believe in all of us as human beings. I believe that we can all do great things. And if you really want to support anything that's going, find the people who are doing real work. I consider myself to be one of those people. I consider Robert Wagner to be one of those people. I consider a few people in this city to be really diligent about changing community and changing the way things look. And I think in this room, there's enough passionate people in here that we can really change this whole entire city. But we have to be willing to have some hard conversations with some people that we think are powerful. But if they cannot do what I'm challenging you to do, which is go investigate with your heart first, then we won't change anything. I'll leave it at that.